What would you do if the person who saved your child's life was standing 20 feet away and you didn't even know his name? Now imagine finding out your own company had known it for 3 years and had quietly paid him to disappear. That's the impossible night one billionaire mother is about to live through. 2 hours earlier, none of it seemed possible because as far as anyone in that ballroom knew, her daughter would never walk again. She ran. Not stumbled, not shuffled forward gripping a walker in two white-knuckled hands. She ran, bare feet slapping cold marble arms, pumping a 7-year-old girl who hadn't taken 10 unassisted steps in 3 years, suddenly sprinting like her whole life depended on the next 10 seconds. Somewhere behind her, a microphone kept broadcasting a sentence nobody in that ballroom would ever remember the end of. Because 300 people had just watched something they could not explain, and explanations, as it turns out, are a lot harder to come by than miracles. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel glowed gold that night the way it always did for the second step gala, chandeliers throwing warm light across round tables dressed in white linen, a jazz trio playing something soft near the bar, a dozen children in wheelchairs and leg braces laughing together like the whole evening had been built just for them, which, in a way, it had. Camille Crowe stood at the podium in a charcoal suit cut so sharp it looked less like clothing and more like armor. At 34, she was the kind of woman whose name made investors sit up a little straighter in their chairs. She'd built Crowe Neural Systems out of a garage in Bellevue into a company that engineered prosthetic limbs guided by thought alone, and she ran every room she entered the same way she ran her company, with total practiced control. Her only jewelry was her late mother's Rolex, worn loose on a wrist she kept pressing her thumb against whenever the room got too quiet. "Every child," she said into the microphone, her voice even and rehearsed, "deserves the chance to run again." She had no idea, standing there under the chandelier light, how completely that sentence was about to come true, or how little say she'd have in how it happened. Near the edge of the stage, in a pale blue wheelchair that had become, over 3 years, less a piece of equipment than a second skin, sat Camille's daughter, Chloe. She'd needed it ever since the fire, when a fall during the rescue left her with a spinal injury no specialist in Seattle could fully explain. Some weeks she had feeling in her legs, and some weeks she didn't, and every doctor Camille consulted used the same careful, uncertain word: incomplete. 7 years old, round-faced, watchful, in a way most children weren't. Her small hands stayed buried in her jacket pockets, one fist curled tight around a scrap of fabric she never let anyone see. She wasn't watching her mother give the speech. She was watching wrists every adult who passed close enough, her eyes dropped there first, quick and quiet, like she was hunting for something she'd misplaced a long time ago and never stopped looking for. Outside, past the tall windows framing the ballroom, the valet lot sat under a wash of sodium streetlight. A dark Range Rover had its hood propped open, and underneath it, a man in a faded blue flannel worked with the unhurried patience of someone who trusted machines a good deal more than microphones. Warren Brooks was 38, built the way men get built from a lifetime of using their hands instead of talking with them. Every few minutes, without seeming to notice he was doing it, he tugged his left sleeve down past his wrist. His son, Calvin, 10 years old, stood beside him, passing wrenches like it was the most natural job in the world. "Dad," Calvin said, wiping grease onto the knee of his jeans, "how come you never wear short sleeves? Not even in July?" Warren gave him the short kind of smile that ends a conversation before it starts and tugged the sleeve down another half-inch. Some habits he'd learned were a good deal easier to keep than to explain. Back inside, Camille reached the line she'd rehearsed a dozen times in the mirror that morning. "Every child deserves the chance to run again," and she never finished it. Below the stage, Chloe shoved her wheelchair sideways so hard the wheel cracked against a chair leg, sending 2 nearby guests jumping in their seats. Then she stood, not braced against the armrest, not wobbling the way 3 years of physical therapy notes said she should. She simply rose, the plain, ordinary way any child rises from a chair, and she ran straight for the glass doors, straight for the stranger kneeling beside somebody else's car. Warren looked up just as she reached him. His hand moved on pure reflex, yanking the sleeve down to hide what was underneath. He was half a second too late. Chloe grabbed his wrist with both small hands, right over the raised, faded line of scar tissue, and said the sentence that would end everyone's carefully arranged evening. "I remember this." Camille's mouth was still open around the word again. No sound came out of it. The microphone hung forgotten at her side, while 300 guests turned one table at a time to see what had frozen their host mid-sentence. Chloe didn't let go. She held onto that scar the way a person holds the one solid railing on a staircase in the dark, staring up at a man she had by every official record in her mother's possession never once met in her life. And Warren, who had spent 3 years perfecting the quiet art of being forgotten, stood frozen under the streetlight, a little girl's small hands wrapped around the one part of himself he had never stopped hiding. Tucked deep in Chloe's jacket pocket, forgotten for the moment, sat a scrap of scorched, checkered fabric. Anyone who looked closely enough would have noticed it matched the sleeve Warren kept pulling down, thread for thread, scorch mark for scorch mark. Nobody was looking that closely yet. By the end of the night, everybody would be, and nothing about the life either family had carefully built would look quite the same again. The murmuring started before Camille even reached the doors. Phones came up around the ballroom, dozens of small glowing rectangles turned toward the window where a girl in a party dress stood gripping a mechanic's wrist like her life had been rebuilt around that single point of contact. Camille's heels struck the marble floor hard and fast, each step echoing louder than the jazz trio that had gone quiet somewhere behind her. "Chloe." Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "Chloe, baby, come here." Warren tried to do the gentle thing. He crouched, easing his wrist free of Chloe's grip, with the same careful patience he used on a stripped bolt. Slow, steady, no sudden force. "I think you've got me confused with somebody else, sweetheart," he said, low enough that only she and Camille could hear. "I'm not who you think I am." Chloe didn't budge. She pointed straight at the scar at the exact place where the skin folded and puckered pink-white against tan skin, and said the kind of detail nobody teaches a 7-year-old to invent. "You got burned pushing the window open so I could crawl out. I remember the smoke on your shirt. It smelled like a campfire that went wrong." That was the first small hinge the whole night would turn on. Because Warren went still not confused, still but caught still, the way a man goes quiet when a memory he buried on purpose climbs back out of the ground on its own. Chloe reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the scrap of scorched checkered fabric she'd carried for 3 years, soft at the edges now, from 1,000 nights of being turned over in small hands. She held it up against Warren's sleeve. The pattern matched. The burn marks matched. Even the frayed stitching along one edge matched thread for thread. Nobody in that circle of onlookers said a word. Somewhere, a champagne glass set down on a table sounded like a gunshot. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray of shrimp cocktail balanced on one palm, forgetting entirely what he'd been about to do with it. Even the jazz trio, 3 songs into their set, let the last note die without starting the next. Camille arrived close enough to see it too, and something in her chest folded in on itself. Because she was back in Bellevue 3 years earlier, without meaning to be. Smoke rolling black across the ceiling, wood cracking somewhere above her like ice giving way on a lake, and a pair of strangers' arms lifting her daughter through a window seconds before the roof came down. She remembered screaming a name into the smoke that didn't belong to anyone standing there. She remembered the paramedics telling her gently that whoever had carried Chloe out had already vanished into the crowd of neighbors on the lawn before anyone thought to ask his name. She had never seen that stranger's face. She had spent 3 years wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing, out of guilt and grief, the way people sometimes build a hero out of a memory too painful to leave empty. She hadn't imagined it. He was standing 6 feet away from her, holding a wrench. "I remember pulling you out," Warren admitted finally, his voice dropped so low it barely carried. "Then I went down. Woke up at Harborview 2 days later and couldn't put a face to any of it clearly. I figured it wasn't my place to go looking, figured I was just somebody who happened to be there." Chloe wasn't finished. While the adults talked in careful half-sentences, she'd slipped her mother's phone from the podium table where it had been left behind, and now she turned the screen around for both of them to see a screenshot she'd saved from a Facebook post Camille had written and quietly deleted 3 years ago. Looking for the anonymous hero who saved my daughter from the fire. Warren's face went the color of ash. He nearly said something. His mouth opened. He swallowed it back down. That was when Calvin, who'd been standing silent this whole time, gripping a wrench like a life preserver, spoke up in the plain, unfiltered way 10-year-olds do. "Dad told me about a kid in a fire once. He said he wasn't worth being remembered for it. That's why he never said anything." The words landed in the middle of the circle like a dropped plate. Camille asked quietly for a private room to talk. Warren shook his head, already reaching for Calvin's shoulder. "I don't need anything from you," he said flat and final. "I just want to take my son home." He might have gotten away with it, too, if a guest standing near the door hadn't already been filming the entire exchange on her phone. The clip went up within minutes. A 30-second video captioned, "Paralyzed girl suddenly runs to a mechanic. Who is he?" And it moved through the gala's private chat threads the way spilled water moves across a tile floor, fast and into every corner at once. By the time Camille's phone started buzzing, it hadn't stopped ringing in almost a decade. Her general counsel first, then her head of communications, breathless. "We need to control this before a real outlet picks it up. Do not let this become a headline." Camille looked at Warren across the lobby with an expression sharpened by 3 years of boardrooms, the look of a woman who assumed, because it was easier than the alternative, that this man had shown up tonight wanting something. Money, leverage, a story to sell. Warren looked back at her the same way, hardened by a version of the same fear. He assumed, because his own history had taught him to, that she was seconds from offering him another check to disappear quietly the way somebody once already had. Neither of them said any of that out loud. They didn't have to. Chloe watched both their faces do the same thing at the same time, and something in her small chest cracked a little further. She saw the text light up on her mother's phone screen before Camille could turn it face down. "Keep this contained. Do not let press near it." Chloe didn't say anything. She just tucked that sentence away with everything else she was learning to carry alone. Warren left the hotel with Calvin's hand in his footsteps echoing across the lobby, refusing every offer to talk further. Camille carried Chloe back up to the penthouse in South Lake Union in silence, the city lights sliding past the car windows like something underwater. That night, once the apartment had gone dark and quiet, Chloe lay very still under her covers and counted to 200 the way she used to count through fire drills at school. She thought about the way her mother's voice had sounded on the phone with the lawyer, careful, clipped, like someone reading instructions off a card instead of speaking from her own heart. She thought about the way Warren's hand had trembled just slightly when he pulled his sleeve back down for the second time that night. Somewhere between those two thoughts, she made up her mind. She got up, found her coat, and slipped down the hallway past the room where the housekeeper usually left a nightlight burning. She asked the family's old driver, the one who still slipped her butterscotch candies from his coat pocket and had known her since before the fire, back when she still had 2 working legs and no reason yet to study strangers' wrists, to take her somewhere her mother had never once let her go alone. A garage in Ballard, its lights still burning long after closing time, waiting the way porch lights wait for a child to finally come home. Whatever was sitting under that garage's fluorescent hum, it was about to turn one difficult night into something neither family would ever be able to take back. He lied to a 7-year-old's face to protect his son. Her company paid a hero to vanish to protect a brand. Comment, Team Warren or Team Camille? Who do you blame more? The garage smelled like motor oil and cold metal. The kind of quiet that only exists after a long day of work has finally stopped. A single fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, flickering every few seconds the way it had for years, and which Warren had never quite gotten around to fixing. There was always a paying customer's car ahead of his own problems in line. Brooks Auto sat on a quiet street in Ballard, wedged between a laundromat and a shop that sold kayaks nobody in winter ever bought, and at this hour, it was the only building on the block with its lights still on. Warren was bent over an old Honda, half his mind still back at the hotel, replaying the moment a stranger's daughter had grabbed his wrist in front of 300 people when he heard footsteps too small and too light to belong to any adult. He looked up. Chloe stood in the doorway, still in her party dress, hair windblown from the drive, cheeks pink from the cold. His first instinct was to reach for his phone and call Camille. His second instinct, the one that stopped him cold, came from Chloe's mouth before he could act on the first. "You left an anonymous comment under Mom's post," she said. "I found it. The account was called Just a Mechanic. That was you." Warren didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face answered for him, and it was the kind of answer a person can't take back once it's out in the open air. He sat down hard on the metal stool by his workbench, hands shaking just slightly, the way hands shake after holding something heavy for far too long, and finally being allowed to set it down. Because this wasn't just a story about a man who'd saved a stranger's daughter and quietly walked away satisfied to never be thanked. This was a man who had seen Camille searching for him, who had read her words alone at night on his phone and typed and deleted 100 replies before finally leaving one small anonymous comment nobody was ever supposed to trace back to him. He had known, and he had chosen on purpose to stay hidden. "Why didn't you say something?" Chloe asked, stepping closer, her voice trembling but steady underneath it, the way a bridge can shake in the wind without ever actually falling. "I remembered you. I remember this." She touched the scar on his wrist again, gentler this time. Warren told her the truth finally, in the plain, unpolished way he told everything. He'd been driving past that house 3 years ago on his way home from a late shift, radio low, thinking about nothing more complicated than what to make Calvin for dinner. Then he saw the smoke, first thick and wrong-colored against the porch light, then the flames climbing along the far wall, then heard a child crying somewhere inside a house that wasn't his own. He didn't think. He never thought in moments like that. Thinking was a luxury for later, for people who got to walk away afterward and sit with what they'd done. He went in on instinct, got burned badly across the wrist and shoulder, pulling the window frame apart with his bare hands, and remembered in pieces, handing a small girl through the gap and telling her to run toward the neighbors on the lawn. After that, the night went soft at the edges, the way a photograph left too long in the sun goes soft. He blacked out somewhere between the yard and the ambulance. When he woke up 2 days later at Harborview Medical Center, bandages up to his elbow, his memory of that night was already smoke itself thin, shifting, impossible to hold on to with any certainty. By the time he was well enough to think clearly, he'd convinced himself he had no right to step forward and claim a moment that felt, in the fog of his own recovery, like it might belong to somebody else entirely. A better man, maybe. A man who deserved to be thanked for it. "So I disappeared," he said. "Figured it was cleaner that way. For everybody." That was when Calvin appeared in the doorway behind Chloe. He'd followed her out of worry the moment he noticed his father's truck missing from the driveway. He said one sentence that would crack the whole night wide open. "Dad kept something. He hid it under the floor. He told me it was a memory he wasn't allowed to talk about." Warren went very still. Then slowly, like a man opening a door he'd nailed shut on purpose, he knelt beside his workbench and pried up a loose floorboard. Underneath sat a small, rusted metal box. Inside wasn't money or anything a person might expect. Inside was a child's charm bracelet, its links warped and blackened at one end, and a single sheet of paper folded into quarters so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The handwriting on it was shaky, clearly written by someone lying in a hospital bed with an IV taped to the back of his hand. "If you're still out there, live a good life. Don't go looking for a stranger." Chloe stared at the bracelet a long moment before she recognized it. The one she'd been wearing the night of the fire. The one everyone assumed had melted somewhere in the wreckage, along with half the house. Her fingers hovered over it but didn't touch it. The way a person hesitates before touching something that feels, all at once, too important to be real. Then Chloe produced one more piece of evidence, something she'd found buried in her mother's laptop files while nobody was watching. A scanned contract 3 years old titled Relocation and Confidentiality Assistance, bearing Warren's signature at the bottom in blue ink. Warren looked at it for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice gone rough and low. "Two men in suits came to see me at Harborview before I was even off the pain medication," he said. "Said they represented your family. Never once said your name. I didn't know it was you until tonight, only that the last name on the paperwork was Crow. Told me real polite that if I ever came forward publicly, they'd have people start asking questions about a grieving single father with no wife and a house that had nearly burned down around his kid. Never said the word threat. Didn't have to." He looked down at the contract, like it weighed more than paper should. "I don't even know if they could have actually done anything to Calvin. Family court doesn't move that fast or that easy, not even for people with money. But I didn't have a lawyer who could have told me that. All I had was a dead wife, a 10-year-old, and 2 men who sounded very sure of themselves. So I signed. I took the money. I disappeared. Not for myself. For him." His silence had never really been about shame over what he'd done. It was about terror of what he might lose by claiming it. A man who had already buried a wife knew exactly how quickly a family could be taken apart by forces bigger than himself, and when 2 strangers offered him an easy way to protect the one person he had left disappearing, felt less like cowardice and more like the only kind of love he still had the power to give. The hero everyone in that ballroom wanted to celebrate, and the frightened father who'd signed that contract in a hospital bed, had been the exact same man the entire time. This was the twist that changed everything the audience thought they understood. This wasn't a man who'd sold his silence for comfort. This was a father who'd been quietly frightened into vanishing not by Camille herself, who had never once been told his name, but by a machine she'd built, and never thought to look inside a legal and crisis management apparatus trained long before that fire to make any inconvenient truth disappear quietly, efficiently, with or without her direct instruction. Because Camille was standing in the doorway now. She'd noticed Chloe missing from her bed at midnight, tracked her phone's location with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and driven across the city still in her gala heels, arriving just in time to hear every word of it. Her face had gone the color of old paper under the garage's fluorescent light. "I never knew your name," she said, barely above a whisper. "I posted that whole thing asking the internet to help me find you. I meant it. I never knew my own people had already found you first and paid you to vanish before I ever got the chance." The garage went completely silent. Chloe looked at her mother, then at Warren, and the tears she'd been holding back all night finally slipped free. Calvin stood frozen, gripping the workbench edge like it was the only steady thing left in the room. Warren didn't say another word. He simply reached for his sleeve and pulled it down again, slower this time than he ever had before, as if the scar underneath had grown heavier with every hour that had passed since the ballroom. The garage was still holding its breath from the last revelation when Camille's phone lit up in her hand, buzzing against her palm like something alive. Not one call, a chain of them back to back, urgent. The kind of ringing that only ever means the ground has shifted under a company while its founder wasn't looking. She answered it standing right there because there was no version of tonight left where she could ask for privacy. The screen filled with the cold, composed faces of her board chairman and 2 of her largest Series C investors, all 3 of them already awake at close to 1 in the morning, which told her everything she needed to know about how far the video had already traveled. Behind them, she could make out the corner of a home office bookshelf, a coffee mug, the ordinary furniture of lives that were about to make a very unordinary decision about hers. They'd seen it. Of course they'd seen it, a grainy 30-second clip of a paralyzed girl suddenly running to a stranger's arms shared into every private chat thread the gala's guest list had access to, then screenshotted, then reposted with captions that grew more dramatic each time. And now the story attached to it had grown teeth. Hero mechanics silenced with hush money to protect a tech founder's image. Someone had already dug up the old deleted Facebook post. Someone else had connected Warren's name to Brooks' Auto. It was, Camille realized with a sick, sinking clarity, no longer a rumor. It was a headline waiting for a publish button. The chairman didn't waste time on pleasantries. If the story wasn't contained within 24 hours, they told her flatly the company's two largest backers were prepared to pull their funding and sever ties publicly. An empire Camille had built with a decade of 18-hour days was suddenly one bad news cycle away from collapsing because of a 30-second video nobody had asked permission to film. Warren stood listening, arms crossed, saying nothing. Then his own phone rang. It was his attorney, the same one, in fact, who'd helped him sign the confidentiality agreement 3 years earlier, back when Warren had been too exhausted with grief to read past the settlement number. His voice on the line was fast and clipped. Someone his best guess was a board member trying to get ahead of the scandal before it could touch Crow Neural Systems directly, had anonymously flagged the old settlement to Washington's Department of Children, Youth, and Families, framing the relocation payment as undisclosed income and raising concerns about the stability of Calvin's home. It wasn't really about Calvin at all. It was about making Warren look less like a wronged father and more like a man who'd already been paid once to disappear and might be angling for a second payday, discrediting him before he could say another word to a reporter. The inquiry itself was only preliminary, the attorney said. Any anonymous tip gets logged and looked into. That part was routine. But routine from a caseworker's mouth and routine from inside Warren's chest were two very different sizes of word. And there was still a real chance of a supervised check-in period while it got sorted out. For the first time since Chloe had grabbed his wrist under the streetlight, real fear moved across Warren's face. Not fear of poverty, not fear of judgment, but the old, familiar fear of losing his son a second time to a system with more power than he had. He'd felt this fear once before in a hospital hallway 3 years ago when a caseworker had asked routine questions about a recently widowed father raising a boy alone, and he had promised himself, right there in that hallway, that he would never again let paperwork decide who got to keep his family together. Now here it was again, dressed in different letterhead, knocking on the same door. Calvin, still holding the wrench he'd carried in from the truck, without noticing, looked up at his father with the particular quiet of a child who understands more than the adults around him wish he did. Chloe watched all of it happen at once. She watched her mother's hand tremble around the phone during the board call. She watched Warren go pale reading a text from his lawyer, and something inside her, already stretched thin from a night no 7-year-old should have had to carry alone, finally gave way. "I wish I'd died in that fire," she said, the words breaking apart halfway through, "instead of watching everybody be this scared because of me." The garage went utterly silent. It was the rawest, most devastating thing anyone in that room had heard all night, heavier than the scar, heavier than the contract, heavier than any threat a lawyer or a board member could make. A child who had once been paralyzed, who had spent 3 years learning to walk again, one careful step at a time, was standing in a mechanic's garage wishing she had never survived at all, if surviving meant watching the grown-ups around her come apart like this. For 3 years, Chloe had carried a secret no adult had ever asked her to carry. The quiet, crushing sense that being alive, being rescued, being loved by 2 families now colliding in one small garage had somehow become a debt she owed everyone around her. What sounded for one terrible second like a child wishing herself away was really the opposite, a small person so full of love for both her mother and the man who'd saved her that she would rather disappear than watch either of them break because of something she never chose to happen. She wasn't asking to die. She was asking in the only language a 7-year-old has for something that big to stop being the reason the people she loved were afraid. Camille dropped to her knees right there on the concrete floor, gala dress and all, and reached for her daughter with both hands. For one long moment she couldn't speak. What broke inside her wasn't the board call or the threat to her company or even the video traveling faster than she could contain it. It was the sudden, complete understanding that she had never personally threatened anyone, and that this was somehow worse, not better. 3 years ago, in the fog of nearly losing her daughter, she had told her team exactly one thing: handle it, protect us, whatever it takes. She had never once asked what handling it looked like. She had never wondered why her own search for the anonymous hero had turned up nothing her lawyers hadn't already quietly buried. She had built a company and a life on the principle that if she simply trusted her people to protect the Crow name, she never had to know the cost of that protection herself. Standing in that garage now, gala dressed dark with grime at the knees, she finally understood not knowing had never made her innocent. It had only made the silence more efficient. And that same efficient, obedient machine, the one she had built to protect her without ever asking it to explain itself, had just turned around and gone looking for a way to protect her again. This time by trying to bury Warren a second time before he could speak. This was the second twist, and it landed heavier than the first. It wasn't only that Warren had been quietly threatened 3 years ago. It was that the threat had never really gone away. It had simply been waiting, patient as a debt collector, for exactly this kind of night to come due. Warren stood to lose both his garage and his son. Camille stood to lose the company she had built from nothing, and Chloe, the one child either family had gone to any length to protect, was the one standing in the middle of it all, quietly wishing she could disappear so that everyone else could go back to being safe. Nobody moved for a long moment. The fluorescent light kept its steady buzz overhead, indifferent to everything unraveling beneath it. Calvin reached over without a word and took Chloe's hand, the way you'd steady someone standing too close to a ledge. And somewhere in that stillness, both parents, the billionaire and the mechanic, the woman who ran boardrooms and the man who ran an engine bay, looked at each other for the first time all night, not as adversaries, but as two people who had each, in their own separate and desperate way, been trying to keep their child safe from a world that kept finding new ways to threaten them. The only question left standing in that garage was whether either of them still had the courage to choose truth over control, now that the cost of silence had finally come all the way home. Warren didn't look at Camille when he finally spoke. He looked at Chloe, still crying quietly against her mother's shoulder, and his voice came out low and rough, each word set down carefully like a tool returned to its exact place on a workbench. "I took that money 3 years ago because I was scared of losing my son," he said. "And now because I took it, I'm about to lose him anyway. You see that?" The silence didn't protect anybody. It just delayed the damage and let it grow bigger in the dark. Camille knelt on the concrete floor of a garage for the first time in her adult life, charcoal suit ruined, and she didn't try to fix her posture or smooth her voice into something more composed. She let it stay broken. "I was wrong," she said. "I was afraid of losing the company, afraid of being seen as the mother who let her daughter almost die in a fire while she was 3 states away closing a funding round. Afraid the whole story I'd built about myself, capable, in control, untouchable, would fall apart in public the moment people learned how close I'd come to losing everything that actually mattered. So I stayed quiet, and I used your fear of losing Calvin to protect my own fear of losing everything else. I'm sorry. I don't know how to make that smaller than it is, so I won't try." She looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly, and added, quieter now, almost to herself, "I told myself for 3 years I was protecting Chloe by not stirring up the past. I never once asked her if that's what she actually needed." Warren wasn't ready to accept it yet, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He shook his head slowly. "An apology doesn't hand Calvin back 3 years of knowing his father saved somebody's life. It doesn't hand your daughter back a childhood where she didn't have to guard a secret all by herself." It was Calvin quiet all night who finally closed the distance neither adult seemed able to cross. He walked over to Chloe, took her hand, the plain, unhesitating way kids do when the grown-ups around them have forgotten how simple some things actually are, and said, "I don't want Dad to lose the garage, and I don't want you wishing you weren't here. Can we just tell the truth now, all of it?" 10 years old, and he'd said in one sentence what neither parent had managed all night. Chloe looked down at their joined hands, then up at Calvin, and for the first time since the ballroom, something close to a real smile moved across her face. Small, uncertain, but real. It was the kind of smile that comes not from things getting easier, but from realizing you're no longer the only one carrying the weight. Something in the room shifted. Camille and Warren looked at each other, really looked, maybe for the first time since the streetlight, and for a moment neither of them was a tech founder or a mechanic board chairman or confidentiality agreement. They were only 2 parents who had spent 3 years each terrified of losing a child in different rooms by different fires, never once realizing how much of that fear they shared. That was when the flashbulbs hit the garage windows. A cluster of local reporters, tipped off by the viral clip, along with two members of Camille's own board who'd tracked her location, the same way she'd tracked her daughters, had gathered outside Brooks' auto. Cameras were already rolling. Whatever happened next wasn't going to stay contained in this garage. The story, one way or another, was about to leave their hands entirely. Camille stood, wiped the grease from her knees with the back of one hand, and looked at Warren and both children in turn. There was no rehearsed line left in her, no podium voice, no practiced cadence. Just a plain decision, made the way most real decisions get made, quietly and all at once. "I'm not going to contain this anymore," she said. "I'm going to tell the truth, even if it costs me everything I've spent 10 years building." Every deal Camille had ever closed, every crisis her company had ever survived, had taught her that control was the same thing as safety, that if she could manage a story well enough, nothing in it could actually hurt her. Standing in that garage, she finally understood the math had been wrong the whole time. The tighter she'd gripped the narrative, the more it had cost the very people she loved most. Walking through that door to tell the truth wasn't bravery in any way a boardroom would recognize. It was the first time in years she had chosen to be powerless on purpose. Warren studied her face for a long moment, checking the way he checked a repair before trusting it back out on the road. Whatever he found there must have been enough, because he gave one small nod, not forgiveness, yet not quite, but the first honest agreement to walk in the same direction. Chloe wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood a little straighter between them, the way a person stands when they've finally set something heavy down. She looked at the garage door, at the flashbulbs blinking through the frosted glass, and at the two people who loved her in two very different, very imperfect ways. Calvin still hadn't let go of her hand. Outside, the reporters kept waiting cameras, trained on a garage door that hadn't opened yet. Inside, 4 people who had spent one impossible night colliding with 3 years of buried truth, stood together in the fluorescent hum, none of them quite ready to walk out that door, but for the first time all night, none of them wanting to run from it either. Camille reached for Chloe's other hand. Warren rested his palm briefly on his son's shoulder. It was a small gesture, the kind that wouldn't make it into any headline written about tonight, but it was the first honest thing either parent had done since the moment Chloe's chair had cracked against that chair leg in the ballroom. Whatever waited on the other side of that door, they were finally going to face it the same way the fire should have been faced 3 years earlier, together, in the open, with nothing left hidden in a rusted box under the floorboards, or buried in a contract nobody was ever supposed to read twice. The garage door creaked as Warren reached for the handle. Somewhere behind him, Chloe took a breath that didn't shake nearly as much as the ones before it. It was time to stop protecting the story everyone had built and start telling the one that was actually true. Chloe wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a breath so deep it seemed to steady the whole room around her. Then she did something nobody expected, not even Camille, who had spent 3 years watching every physical therapy session, tracking every inch of progress in a binder she kept on her nightstand. She stood up on her own. No wall, no wheelchair, no hand under her elbow, fully, easily, the way a person stands when they've finally stopped waiting for permission. She didn't run to Warren, the way the whole night had been building toward. She walked slow and sure, and took his hand in one of hers. Then she reached back and took her mother's hand in the other. And she pulled them both together toward the garage door, toward the cameras, toward the flashbulbs, toward the truth that had been waiting 3 years to be told out loud. Chloe stepped in front of the reporters first, still in her rumpled party dress, chin up, voice steadier than anyone in that garage had any right to expect from a 7-year-old. "This is the man who saved me the night of the fire," she said. "His name is Warren Brooks, and this is my mom. Nobody has to be quiet or scared because of me anymore." Every twist before this one, the scarred wrist, the hidden contract, the board's ultimatum, the custody inquiry, had only been leading here. The video that started the whole night had simply been the spark. The contract had been the kindling. The board call and the fear of losing Calvin had been the fire catching fully alight. But it was this moment, a child once told she might never walk again, standing steady on her own 2 feet, holding the hands of both the man who saved her and the mother who almost let fear cost her everything. That burned brightest of all. And it was the one moment nobody in that garage would ever be able to take back or quietly bury again. Camille lost the thing she'd feared losing most: control over her own story. Warren lost the thing he'd used to protect his son, the safety of staying invisible. But what they gained back, standing there in front of the cameras, was larger than either loss. Chloe no longer had to carry a secret by herself. Calvin no longer had to wonder if his father might vanish the way the story about the fire once had. And for the first time in 3 years, nobody in that garage had a scar left to hide under a sleeve. 3 months later, the Second Step Gala returned to the same gold-lit ballroom at the Fairmont Olympic. This time, Camille didn't open with a rehearsed line about products or funding rounds. She simply said, "The man who saved my daughter was never anonymous. His name is Warren Brooks. And for 3 years, I was the reason nobody knew it." Warren stood near the front row, one hand resting on Calvin's shoulder, the other holding Chloe's, who stood tall and steady beside him. He didn't pull his sleeve down this time. The scar on his wrist caught the stage lights plainly, openly, the way any old wound looks once a person finally stops being ashamed of surviving it. Chloe smiled up at him, the first smile all night that didn't carry the weight of a secret underneath it. The custody inquiry had closed within a week, quietly, once the truth came out, and Camille herself had provided a statement clearing away every shadow the old contract had cast. Brooks Auto stayed open. Camille's board, rattled at first by the headlines, found instead that the honesty steadied more than it shook. Investors, it turned out, trusted a founder who told the truth under pressure, a great deal more than one who tried to manage her way around it. Calvin had started coming by the Crow offices some Saturdays, more interested in the robotics lab than any of it, while Chloe had taken up learning basic engine repair from Warren, one bolt at a time, in the same garage where the whole truth had finally come out. This story reminds us that silence, even when it feels like protection, can grow heavier than the truth it was meant to guard. Camille believed staying quiet for 3 years would keep her family safe. Instead, it nearly cost her the people she loved most, and it took a 7-year-old's courage to prove that truth, however late, is stronger than any story built to protect it. Most of us are carrying some version of that same silence, a thing we've been meaning to say but keep setting aside, telling ourselves it will be easier later. It rarely is. If there's someone in your life you've been protecting with silence, this week is the week to change that. Not with a grand gesture, with something small and specific. Tonight, before bed, sit down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the box of blank cards in the hall closet drawer, the ones from the pharmacy you never quite get around to using. Write one true thing you've been meaning to say to a grandchild in Denver you haven't thanked for calling every Sunday, a neighbor who shoveled your walk all winter without being asked, a sister you haven't spoken plainly with since your husband passed. Then mail it, not a text, an actual card with a stamp. A letter someone can hold in their own kitchen matters more than words that scroll past and vanish. If it's an apology you're carrying, don't wait for the perfect sentence. Pick up the phone and say the first honest thing that comes to mind. Silence rarely needs eloquence to end it, only needs one voice willing to go first. Healing rarely arrives on a stage under bright lights. It arrives in small, deliberate honesty, a card at the kitchen table instead of a rehearsed goodbye. One phone call instead of another year of waiting for the right moment. Somewhere, tonight, someone you love is still waiting for you to stop protecting them with silence and simply tell them the truth instead. Real people wrote these scripts with passion and purpose to spark reflection and change. AI was merely a helpful tool that polished the delivery, making sure profound yet practical messages about respect, redemption, and human dignity within the family reached as many hearts as possible.